Yevamos Daf begins immediately following a Mishnah, contains two additional Mishnayos, and ends off with another Mishnah. So we have three primary sugyas on the Daf. The first is that which we have said that a woman or anyone else is believed to testify that a man had died and therefore his wife is allowed to remarry. What about concerning monetary issues? Can she inherit a ksuba, and do the inheritors of the husband who died collect the inheritance? The Gemara will discuss what exactly the wife says when she's believed, and it depends what she's exactly claiming as far as whether or not she is actually believed. Then we get to the next Mishnah, which discusses who is believed to testify that a woman's husband had died. Most people are believed, but there are some exceptions, 5 or possibly 7 people who are not believed. And then the second Mishnah will introduce the sugya of what happens when we have conflicting testimony. Whom do we believe as far as the death of the husband? So let's begin. We've seen in the most recent Mishnah, which we've just ended, that there is a takana that we believe people. We believe Psule Adam, the woman herself, or anyone else, to say that a woman's husband had died, but that's only as far as allowing her to remarry, as far as Isser, but not as far as monetary issues. However, she can collect her ksuba. There's a special limud from the text of the ksuba that if she's remarrying, she can collect her ksuba automatically. But the inheritors do not inherit the property of the husband. The Gemara says there's one exception, and that's if yibum happens. We allow her to remarry. If her husband had died without children, then we allow her to go to yibum. So the yavam, the one who's doing the yibum, he does collect the inheritance. And the reason for that, the Gemara says, is the entire way we know she collects her ksuba is based on the text of the ksuba. Well, if you look in the text of the Torah, it's pretty clear that the yavam gets to collect the property of the dead brother whenever he does yibum. And that's because it says, Yakum al Shem Achiv Hames, that he takes the place of the brother who died, and this one is taking the place. So whether you believe her, you believe that the husband had died for monetary issues or not, the bottom line is he's doing yibum. If he's doing yibum, then he gets to collect. Now, the Gemara discusses that what happens when the woman is the one who says that her husband had died. We said that she's believed as far as collecting her ksuba and as far as being able to remarry, but the only reason for that is because if she's remarrying, then she should automatically be allowed to collect the ksuba. Collecting the ksuba is dependent on remarriageability. So the Gemara says, what if she comes in though and she says, hey, my husband died overseas, give me my ksuba. So now she's not believed because she's not claiming to remarry, she's just claiming the ksuba. That she's not believed on. Now what if she comes in and she has both things? So if the first thing she says is, allow me to remarry and then give me my ksuba, why is she mentioning the ksuba here? Do we view this as she wants to remarry and then she's saying, since I'm remarrying, give me my ksuba? Or is she really trying to get to the ksuba and she's saying, hey, you have to let me remarry in order for me to get to my ksuba, so okay, let me remarry and give me my ksuba. What's the primary and what's the secondary? Now, if you want to say that the primary is that she wants to remarry, now what happens if it's in reverse order? What if she first says, give me my ksuba, and then she says, allow me to remarry? Do we assume here that the primary is the ksuba? Or could we say here as well that the primary is the remarriage? She just doesn't know what is dependent on what. Does she need to get the ksuba in order to remarry? Does she need to remarry in order to get the ksuba? And therefore, she says two things. All right, this concludes the Gemara's comments on that mission. Now we get to our next mission, which introduces the 5 types of testimony in this Mishnah. There'll be 2 additional, which will be discussed in the Gemara. But here we have 5 people who are not believed to testify that a woman's husband had died. And the reason is because these 5, we potentially suspect that they hate the woman and they're trying to mess her up by having her remarry with out clear evidence that her husband had died and maybe the husband will come back. So these 5 are all relatives of her husband, and therefore they're jealous of her or they're upset that she's taking their property and using it up when as part of her marriage to her husband. Now they are her husband's mother, her husband's sister through the mother, her husband's other wife, her husband's daughter, and one who is not really a relative of her husband but is a corollary to her husband's wife, and that's the woman who's going to be her co-wife if she ends up falling to yibum, the current wife of the man who would be her yavam. Now, to work through these one at a time, there is an inheritance there's property that the husband has when she, by being married to the husband, uses that up, and therefore it creates an enmity between her and the people who originally owned that. So let's say her husband's mother. So her property, which belongs to her husband, ends up going to Yerusha to this woman's husband, and she eats that up. It's part of being married to him. So her mother-in-law, her husband's mother, is upset about that. Her husband's sister, same thing, sister through the mother, she's upset because her own mother's property is going to the husband. Now, co-wife, of course, they compete for the husband's attention. The Yevama, that's the wife of the man who would be her Yavam, her husband's brother. She is a potential future co-wife, which is why they don't like each other. And the daughter of the husband, this is not her daughter, this is her husband's daughter, it would be her stepdaughter. So she is competing with this woman's mother. She is the wife of this woman's father, and she's possibly coming after this woman's mother was married to her husband, and therefore she's stepping in place of the mother and causing enmity between them. All right, now the Gemara begins by discussing other potential women who shouldn't be believed. So the Gemara's first one is, what about the daughter of her husband's father? That is her father-in-law's daughter. What would be the status over there? So we said that her mother-in-law's daughter is upset because the mother-in-law's property goes to the son, and this wife is using them up. What about the daughter of the father? The central question is, why is there hatred between the woman and the daughter of her mother-in-law? Is it because the mother-in-law potentially hates her because her property is being used up? And if the mother-in-law hates her, then her daughter is also going to, out of solidarity with her own mother. And in this case, there is no solidarity with the mother because this is the daughter of the father-in-law, and there is no specific solidarity with the father. Or do we say, no, the point is that the property is being used up, and in this case, the property is being used up as well, because the daughter of the father-in-law is having her father's property being used up by this inheritor, and she's upset about that. Says the Gemara, let's bring a proof. The Mishnah said that there are 5 women who are not kosher to say testimony about the death of the husband. It does not mention the daughter of the father-in-law. That's not one of the 5. If you want to add that, then there will be 6. So the Gemara says, no, the daughter of the father-in-law is including the daughter of the mother-in-law. It's the same logic, and therefore you say the daughter of the in-laws, and that's what's meant. So the Gemara asks a question. We have a different Mishnah that says that there are 7 women. Here in our Mishnah, we only have a list of 5, so where do you get 7 from? So the Gemara says that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda adds 2. He adds the stepmother, that is the woman's father's wife, and the daughter-in-law, that's the woman's son's wife. So he adds, in addition to the 5 relatives of the woman's husband, he has 2 relatives of the woman herself, her stepmother, and her daughter-in-law. So the Gemara says, why do the Chachamim not add these? The Gemara says the Chachamim say we don't add these very simply because these are the reverse of a relationship which is already in the Mishnah. We have in the Mishnah stepdaughter. You want to add stepmother. If you already can't accept the testimony of the stepdaughter, so then the reverse, the stepmother, you wouldn't accept either. If one can't testify on the other, then the other can't testify on the one. Same thing applies to the daughter-in-law. You don't have to put daughter-in-law on the list because you already had mother-in-law on the list. So just like the mother-in-law can't testify to free her daughter-in-law to remarry, the daughter-in-law can't testify for the mother-in-law. Now, the Gemara says, why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda hold like that? The Gemara says Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with that because he says that the logic does not apply. The reason that the mother-in-law has a problem is because the mother-in-law's property, which went to her husband, is being used up by her daughter-in-law. The daughter-in-law doesn't have her property used up by her mother-in-law, so why should she have an issue there? And as far as the stepmother, so we said that there's a problem, that the stepdaughter has a problem with her stepmother, and that's because the stepmother is using up her own mother's property. Her own mother was the original wife, she brought all her property in, it went to her husband, she's gone now, and the stepmother is stepping in and taking all that over. So the stepdaughter is upset at the stepmother and therefore may testify falsely to mess her up, but the stepmother doesn't have a problem with the stepdaughter. So Gemara says that's such a good argument, then why would Rabbi Yehuda taka asa these two women from saying Edus? Gemara says there's a different reason. And that's that they both are in a close personal relationship with their husband, and therefore they reveal negative information about them to the husband, and that's why they are upset. Now, why do the Chachamim disagree with this taina, though? Why do they say that they are included? That if stepdaughter is usher, stepmother is usher. If stepmother is usher, stepdaughter is usher. And if mother-in-law is usher, daughter-in-law is usher. Why are those the same? So the Gemara says that's based on the pasuk in Mishlei Kamayim Apanam Apanam Kenli Va'adam La'adam. If someone hates someone else, that person will hate him back in return. If you see someone shows a hated face to you, it creates hatred, and therefore even if only one side has a reason, they both hate each other and will create problems to each other. Rabbi Yehuda says that pasuk is not talking about two people. That pasuk is talking about a person's relationship with the Torah. If you are, how you treat the Torah is how the Torah is going to treat you. If you are willing to put hard work into the Torah will invest in you and you will understand it. Otherwise, it's not going to go. Now the Gemara is a shaila. What about someone who is going to, in the future, become the mother-in-law? We said you can't testify on the mother-in-law. What about a future mother-in-law? What would that be? That would be the mother of the Yavam. Assuming her husband and her husband's brother have different mothers, would she be also to testify about her Yavam's mother, the brother of her husband, who she's going to fall to Yibam, her Yavam's mother? And the Gemara primarily focuses on, is that future mother-in-law usher to say testimony to her? What's the crux of the issue? Do you think about a future relationship which is going to displease you? Do you already have problem with the person who's in the future going to become your daughter-in-law and therefore would say negative testimony to mess them up? So Gemara wants to try to bring a proof. So the Gemara has a case of a woman who comes and she says, my husband died and my mother-in-law's husband died. Both I and my mother-in-law are permitted to go remarry. Now, a woman is generally not believed on her mother-in-law, as we said, because her mother-in-law speaks evil of her to her husband. So the question here is, though, that she's not her mother-in-law anymore. Once she says, my husband died, and she's believed on that, then this woman's not related to her, because it's her husband's mother, and her husband is no longer her husband, he's dead. So Gemara says, still, you can't believe her about her husband. She is believed about herself, and she's allowed to get remarried, but she's not believed to testify on her husband's mother, on her mother-in-law. And the reason is, although it's not her mother-in-law anymore, it could be that the entire story was a lie. The only reason she said her husband died is in order to be able to mess up her mother-in-law by being believed on that she knew if her husband was alive, she couldn't testify about her mother-in-law. So she said her husband died. Now she can testify about her mother-in-law and mess her mother-in-law up. Now, what's the problem? Obviously, her husband and her mother-in-law's husband are not here. So if her mother-in-law's husband's not here and her husband's not here, her mother-in-law is not saying negative things about her to her husband. So where is the issue? Why is she obviously she's afraid that in the future her husband's going to come back and her mother-in-law is going to be a thorn on her side at that point. She's going to say negative things to her husband. That being the case, that would be the explanation behind her strategy to cause problems to her mother-in-law at this point. So you see that even though there's a potential hatred scenario going to be created in the future, and it's not here now, that's enough, and therefore would asa her. Versus here, it's potentially different. You can't bring a proof from this, because here she already had the experience of having this woman being her mother-in-law while her husband was here. She already suffered from this woman, and therefore that's why she wants to get rid of her. She wants to head her off, so because she knows that scenario is going to come back when her husband comes back from Medina Siyam. In your case, though, you're talking about the mother of the Yavam. She never had any negative relationship with her. There isn't any reason why we should assume that she would. Okay, this concludes the Gemara's comments on this Mishnah. Now we get to our next Mishnah, which discusses what happens when you have conflicting testimony. So we have three cases in the next Mishnah: 1 against 1, 1 against 2, and 2 against 1. So if you have one aide that initially comes and says that husband has died, she can get remarried. Another husband that says, then you have another aide that comes and says that he's alive and she can't get remarried. The Mishnah's psak is, if she already got remarried, she can stay. However, she should not, the implication is she should not get remarried in the first place. The Gemara will say that that's not a correct implication. Next case is if she had two witnesses that came and said she is allowed to get remarried, her husband had died, and then one comes and says, he is alive. Obviously, the two defeat the one. The Gemara will ask, what's the chiddush? And she's allowed to get remarried even if she's not married yet. If you had one that said she can get remarried and then two come and say that he's alive, then even if she's already married, she does have to leave him. She does have to go separate from him because it's 1 against 2. Okay, so the Gemara begins by asking, when you have 1 against 1, why is it that you consider them, you only allow her to stay remarried if she's remarried already? You should allow her to remarry in the first place. And the reason is because we have a rule that Ula says, anytime one aid or any other pasul aid is given the power of belief through rabbinic decree or whatever it is, it counts as 2 witnesses. So therefore the one aid that came and said her husband died and she's allowed to get remarried is 2 now and has the power of 2. So the one that comes afterwards should be 1 going up against something with the power of 2. You should believe the first one and not the second one, because the first one has the power of 2 and the second one does not. Says the Gemara, you're right, and that is the halacha. The first one is believed and the second one is not. However, that's only in the case where they already accepted his testimony and gave her a permission to remarry. So if at that point, the first one counts as 2. And now, even if she didn't remarry, she can go and remarry, even though there's the second aid comes now. The opposite aid comes now. If, however, they did not accept her testimony, they did not accept the testimony of the first aid yet, it still counts as 1. It doesn't get the status of 2 until it's accepted. And in that case, she would not be able to accept it. It would just be 1 against 1. All right, now the Gemara goes to the case of 1 aid that said that she is allowed to remarry, her husband had died, and 2 that said that they are not. Mishnah said we go with the 2 over the 1. Gemara says, what's the chiddush? 2 against 1, of course. Gemara says the case here is where the 2 is where you have psulim against psulim. You have non-acceptable edim against non-acceptable edim, and we're using the concept of Rabbi Nechemia, which the Gemara will explain. There's 2 versions of the Gemara's answer here. So what Rabbi Nechemia said is as follows. He said, whenever you have trust of people that are not generally accepted, you count all psulei edim as the same. So when eid echad is generally not accepted, that means you're also going to accept women, you're also going to accept other psulim. That's rule number 1. And they're all considered even. In eid echad, doesn't matter if he's a man, does not have any priority over a woman. They all have the same level. You don't start counting and measuring the validity of psulei edis. They're all psulei edis, but they're all accepted, so they're all good. The only thing you count is numbers. And here, there is no rule of trei kamei. There's no rule of 2 has full, complete nemanis, and above 2 doesn't add anything, which is a general rule you have by kosher edim. Here, you count. So if you have 1 against 2, you go with the 2. You have 3 against 2, you go with the 3. You have 98 against 99, you go with the 99. So what it's teaching here is as follows. So now here we have 2 versions. The Gemara's first version is that the first aid is a man. He's in aid echad. And the second 2 are both women. And the chiddush is that the 2 who come later, even though they're women, don't have any less credibility than that man, because they're all considered to be psulei edim. He's in aid echad, they're nashim. And therefore we just count numbers, 2 against 1, and the Mishnah is telling us we go with the 2 over the 1. That's the first version of this. The second version is that no. If the first one that comes is a man, then he's a regular eid echad. It's kol makom sheminater harei kan shnayim. He counts as a million edim, and there's nothing anybody could do to knock that out afterwards. What we're talking about is where the first one to come was a woman. And in that situation, there, the numbers of women which come afterwards will count numbers. We won't have any special nemanis to the first one over the second one. So if the first one's a woman, so she's a psulei edis, we're not going to accept her edis as being 2, as being a million. And if 2 women come afterwards, we'll take the 2 over the 1. However, had it been a man, then he would have had full nemanis of kol makom shehemina teir le'erachad harei kan shnayim. Now the Gemara says, what about the next case in the Mishnah where you had 2 edim that said that he died, and 1 that says he did not die? So we go with the 2 over the 1. So the Gemara says, what's the chiddush of this? If it's Rabbi Nechemia that you always go with numbers and when you are dealing with psulei edis, so we already said that. So the Gemara says, the chiddush is that you say that even l'kula. You may have thought you only say it l'chumra, but here it's going l'kula. It's believing the 1 unequal power with the 2, and that's a chiddush which you would not necessarily have known from the first case. Now we get to our next Mishnah, which discusses what happens if there are 2 wives, and they say potentially different things. So what is the halacha? Who do you believe? So we have three cases in the Mishnah. The first case is where the two wives come. One says our husband is alive, and the other says no, our husband is dead. So here, the halacha is that they're both believed. The one who says that the husband is alive has to stay married. She's also to marry anyone else, and she doesn't get a ksuba. But the one who says the husband is dead, she is believed, and she gets to get remarried, and she gets her ksuba. Now, the next case is where they argue how he died. So there's conflicting. There's something wrong here, but they both agree that he died. One says he died naturally, and one says he was killed. So here you have a machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, who seem to be the Tanakama who discussed the first case, they say, since they both agree that he died, even though they are in dispute with each other, they can both get remarried and collect their ksuba. Now, Rabbi Meir disagrees. He says, since they don't fit together, they have different stories, they're both not believed, and neither of them can get remarried. Now, the third case is where you have witnesses. So you have two witnesses. One says he's dead, one says he's not dead. Or you have two women witnesses. One says he's dead, one says he's not dead. Neither of them were accepted and established before the other one arrives. That's the case. They just came together and said opposite things. So there the halacha is they go against each other and they're canceled, and you cannot allow her to get remarried based on either of them.